Now, I want to go to economic interdependence theory and talk about that. And I want to compare it to my realist theory and tell you why I think it is not as good a theory. It's not to say that economic interdependence theory cannot explain anything. It's not to say it's totally useless. I'm not making that argument. I'm just making the argument that it is not nearly as powerful an argument as realism. And I'm going to explain why, and I'm going to do it on the basis of two words. But before I get to those two words, one of which I've talked about already, I want to tell you a bit more about economic interdependence theory. I wrote Tragedy of Great Power Politics in 2001. Shortly thereafter, I went to China for the first time. And I've been to China many times, and I found almost immediately that I was something of a rock star in China. And this was despite the fact I was making the argument that China cannot rise peacefully and that the United States should do everything it can to slow down Chinese economic growth. And nevertheless, I constantly got invited back to China, and everywhere I went to speak, I faced huge audiences. And many people who I talked to would try to refute my argument. I once asked the Chinese why they kept inviting me back since I was making the argument that China cannot rise peacefully. And one of the arguments, which I always found quite amusing, was they said, "You're the first American we've met who admits that the United States is ruthless." Because, you know, my argument is that all great powers are ruthless, including the United States. And they were used to having all these liberal Americans come over and tell the Chinese that we're a benign hegemon. I'm sure some of you in the audience believe this. And I told them that that was nonsense. The United States is not a benign hegemon. If you're an ally of the United States, most of the time we treat you quite well. But the United States is a ruthless great power. And the Chinese liked hearing that. But the second reason that the Chinese were very interested in talking to me, and the most important reason, is they said they wanted to figure out how they could defeat my argument, right? And basically they said, this is a very powerful argument, Professor Mearsheimer. We accept that you have a powerful argument, but we want to figure out how to defeat your argument. And anyway, the argument that they invariably turned to was economic interdependence theory, right? And let me just say a word about that. I think of the liberal theories, the most powerful of the three liberal theories is democratic peace theory. I don't think it is as powerful as realism, but I think democratic peace theory is the most powerful of the liberal theories. The Chinese could not turn to democratic peace theory because they did not intend to become a democracy, right? The argument, as you all know, is that democracies don't fight other democracies. And China was not a democracy and not planning to become a democracy. And therefore, they were not going to use that theory against me. So they went to economic interdependence theory. And this is the argument that they made. We are hooked on capitalism, just like you. We have been integrated into this global international economic order that you created during the Cold War and have expanded now in the unipolar moment. And we're part of it, and we are getting very rich. And you, the United States, are also getting very rich, and Japan is getting very rich. Everybody's getting very rich. And who would slay the goose that lays the golden egg or golden eggs? That was the argument, right? If you strip away all the layers of the onion, basically what they were saying is that prosperity is of enormous importance to all of these states, and that achieving prosperity would guarantee that you didn't have any major crises or any wars among the great powers. And here we're talking, of course, about China and Russia, so that China could rise and the United States could rise. Just to come at this from the American point of view, when John, the realist, would say to American liberals that China is getting more and more prosperous, and it could turn that economic might into military might. Their argument is that's not going to happen. And who cares if they're getting more prosperous or wealthier relative to us over time, right? Because we're getting wealthy too, right? Everybody's getting rich. This is a wonderful gig we have here, right? Who cares whether the Chinese are getting richer than we are? It doesn't matter. From my point of view, as somebody who cares about the balance of power, it matters enormously, but it didn't matter for them because everybody's getting prosperous. And in the liberal story, which Americans believed hook, line, and sinker, because of the importance of prosperity, you'd have no war between the United States and China. You see the argument here? Now, what's the difference between realism and economic interdependence theory? Two words. Survival sits at the heart of my argument, and prosperity sits at the heart of their argument. And in a world where survival is your principal goal, and you are worried about the balance of power, you will behave in aggressive ways that do not apply in a world where prosperity is your principal goal. Right? You just want to understand the distinction here between prosperity, which is the core causal mechanism in economic interdependence theory, and survival, which is the core causal mechanism in realism. To give you one example quickly to illustrate this, the period in Europe here before 1914. As many of you, I'm sure, know, there was a huge amount of economic interdependence in Europe before 1914. There really was. And it involved all countries. At the same time, there was an intense security competition that revolved around two alliances, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance. Triple Entente, of course, is France, Britain, and Russia. The Triple Alliance is Austria-Hungary, and Imperial Germany, and Italy, right? And you had this intense security competition, which leads to the July crisis in 1914, and ultimately on August 1st, 1914, to World War I. And this is all happening in a world where there is a huge amount of economic interdependence and everybody's getting prosperous. What happened here? Survival considerations trumped prosperity. I believe that World War I was basically a preventive war started by Germany, and Germany was scared stiff that the balance of power was shifting against Germany. The Russians, who had been defeated in the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, were coming back from the dead. The French and the British were doing all sorts of things to prepare for a possible war. The Germans thought that the balance of power was shifting against them. They saw a window of opportunity. They launched a preventive war. That's my view. It's a security argument. Putin going into Ukraine, that's a preventive war. It's a preventive war, right? Security, survival, right? You never can underestimate the extent to which survival, the idea that survival is of the utmost importance. You see this in Hobbes, by the way. It's very clear. That's the one natural law in Hobbes, that every person should seek to survive, right? It's of enormous importance, right? So it's survival that trumps prosperity. Now, let me conclude by just talking about economists and how economists think about the world, okay? And contrast that with how realists like me think about the world. And I want you to keep in mind as I move forward here that there is some overlap between economic interdependence theory and how economists tend to think about the world. For the most part, economists in the West since 1945 have paid very little attention to geopolitics. Very little attention to geopolitics. If you think in terms of two variables, here's geopolitics and here's economics or the business world. Those were in very important ways two different worlds. Now, why do I say that? For those of us in the room who are old enough to remember the Cold War, right, there was obviously a profound geopolitical competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the United States and its allies, and the Soviet Union and its allies. But there was actually remarkably little economic intercourse. You know, people talk about the liberal international order that was created in 1945. It was not an international order. That order that was created that involved things like the IMF, the World Bank, the European Coal and Steel Community, and so forth and so on, which became the EC, then became the EU. All those institutions that were created in the West. The Soviet Union had their own set of institutions. They had their own order, okay? And there was remarkably little economic interaction between the two orders. This meant that geopolitics and economic considerations, business considerations, were not intertwined. Then comes the unipolar moment. And in the unipolar moment, there's only one great power, the United States of America. So there's no geopolitics. You all understand that? There's no geopolitics during the unipolar moment. There's no great power politics. There's only one great power. You can't have great power politics if you have only one great power. So the business world that you grew up in, most of you in the audience came of age in, the unipolar moment starting in 1992, after the Soviet Union collapses, December 1991. The unipolar moment, which most of you grew up in, was a world in which geopolitics hardly mattered at all. And therefore, there was no discussion of how the business community, how the economic world and the security world interacted with each other, just as was the case for different reasons in the Cold War. Then in 2017, the unipolar moment ends and we move into multipolarity. We have three great powers, and economic considerations and security considerations are intertwined in ways that we've never seen before. It's very important to understand that economics really matters. You all understand we, the United States, are in an intense security competition with China that has a military dimension for sure, but also has an economic dimension involving sophisticated technologies. We pay enormous attention these days to supply chains and so forth and so on. So economics and geopolitics are inextricably bound up for the first time. So the question you have to ask yourself is, what happens in the world that we now live in when economic considerations clash with security considerations? Where those logics that are developed in economics departments, where they pay virtually no attention to security. Do you think people in economics departments think about anarchy and survival and the balance of power? They do not. It's not part of their lexicon. That's part of the realist lexicon. What they're concerned with is generating prosperity. That's how economists think about the world. What can we do to fix the system in ways that generate prosperity for everyone? And economists don't care whether China is growing faster than the United States is. Realists certainly do, but economists don't, because economists, like people who do political economy or economic interdependence theory, those people focus on prosperity. Economists are interested in prosperity. Realists are interested in survival. So the point I'm making to you, this will be my final point, is that moving forward, I am not arguing that economic interdependence theory is useless, or that the theories that economists bring to bear in terms of thinking about how the international economy functions are useless. Not my argument at all. My point is that when those economic theories or economic interdependence theory clashes with realist logic will win almost every time. And the main reason is because survival in an anarchic system where you cannot know the intentions of other states that may be very powerful, forces you to behave in aggressive ways that have no place in those liberal theories like economic interdependence or the liberal theories that dominate in the economics profession.